On behalf of the Ventry Center here at Central Seminary, I do welcome all of you to this fifth session of our continuing education series, Faith Leadership in the Context of Climate Change. I'm delighted that again you have carved out time from busy schedules to be here with ministry colleagues for learning and discussing the new challenges and opportunities of ministry in the midst of a changing climate. As always, I invite you to write in the chat your name, where you're zooming in from, what faith leadership role you're serving in, with what church or group. I've kind of said that as you come in, but there are others who may join us as well. So far in this series, we've heard about the science of climate change. We've looked at biblical, theological, and ethical perspectives. We've explored eco-spirituality. We've looked at what pastoral leadership means in the context of climate change. And today we're fortunate enough to have Josh Richardson with us to talk about ministry opportunities in the context of climate change, building church and community resiliency, advocacy, climate justice, and mercy ministries for those affected by climate change. It's a lot of subjects, and I told him to go where he would like to go with that. But it's that outward look in the ministries, in that outward look that we're thinking about, as well as actually inward resiliency building. Josh Richardson is the executive director of Brugmansia Ministries and the pastor of St. Louis Mennonite Fellowship. Brugmansia Ministries, if you look on their website, tells us that they partner with faith organizations to rethink ministry in light of the challenges of climate change and climate-induced migration. And by evaluating community infrastructures, risks, and opportunities in light of projected impacts, Brugmansia helps faith organizations take concrete steps to address existing local challenges while being more prepared to address future impacts as well. So they're currently working across the United States to help faith communities adapt their buildings and grounds and change their ministries to meet the needs created by climate change. You've received Josh's bio that I sent yesterday, I believe, but I want to highlight how Josh speaks from both the standpoint of education and training as a geologist and from the perspective of being a public theologian. And pastor. He holds a master's of science in geological sciences from Ohio University and a master of public ministry with a concentration in ecological regeneration from Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary. With Brugmansia, Josh has been nationally recognized for his work with seminaries, congregations, denominations, and other nonprofits on how to better understand the impacts of climate change on local communities and respond with justice-centered strategies for addressing those challenges. So we're so delighted you're here with us, Josh. Josh will speak for an hour, and then, as we normally do, there'll be an opportunity for you to ask questions and engage in discussion with him and with one another. So during the presentation, I invite you again to please stay muted in consideration of others and the recording. But then during the discussion time, or whenever Josh asks you to, you can unmute yourself and ask questions, make comments, engage in conversation, and maybe share some of what your congregations are doing in light of the changes that come with climate change. And so, Josh, we eagerly welcome you. We're delighted that you are here with us, and we look forward to what you're going to share with us.
Great. Well, it's great to be with you all. I want to start simply by thanking Ruth and the Buttrey Center. It's an absolute honor to get to speak with you today. So we're going to be talking about climate resilience and thinking about ministry in that context. I like having conversations, and so I also am someone that when I'm listening to a talk, I will come up with a great question, and then I'll forget it about halfway through. And so if you have a burning question as we go through things, feel free to interrupt and ask questions. There will be a couple of spots and breaks through the talk for questions as well. But also, if there's something that's burning, I would rather have a more of a conversational tone. So let's see. So as Ruth mentioned, we're going to be talking about ministry today. My name's Josh. I'm the executive director of Brugmansia Ministries. This is going to be more of a a talk on how to think about climate change. So it's going to incorporate a lot of the things you've already talked about, but maybe thinking more specifically about ministry, and what ministry looks like with all that other information. So with the spiritual information, the theological, and the climate change information. So I want to start by simply acknowledging the reality that we're finding ourselves in ministry right now, and the challenge of doing ecological work in this reality, right? So a lot of the conversations that I've been having with people, on high levels in the environmental movement is it even right to be doing environmental movement at this time, right? Environmental ministry. We have issues with immigration enforcement. There are people starving, people are losing benefits, loss of health care. Our farmers are struggling. My underlying assumption, though, is that all of these things are connected. And so how we have treated the environment has got us to this place. And so one of the most poignant things to do and one of the most prescient things to do is to really think about how we can change how we treat the environment to get out of this place. And so that's sort of how I'm going to be framing our talk today. But I want to start by asking you all a question. So if you can type this in the chat, it's a little bit of an icebreaker. So who is your favorite biblical prophet? Okay, Amos, yeah. Yeah, Jeremiah, Isaiah, Ezekiel. Yeah, Isaiah. Jeremiah. Amos. Okay, well, while those come in, I'm going to tell you about my favorite biblical prophet, which is Joseph. So I have been referring to Joseph as the patron saint of climate resilience. If you remember the story of Joseph, Joseph was living in Egypt, and Pharaoh had a vision, and Joseph interpreted that vision to say, okay, there's going to be years of plenty and then years of famine. And Joseph's responsibility was then to look at all of the systems in Egypt to understand what they would need to do to provide for people when they had years of famine. And so today we're going to sort of walk alongside Joseph as our model for biblical leadership, to think about climate resilience in that way of what do we need to do for our years of famine in the future. So what did Joseph need to know for his ministry to make sure that people didn't starve in Egypt? He needed to know the current state of the Egypt and its infrastructure. He needed to know the political, the organizational, and the social systems involved in food production and storage. He also needed to know who the stakeholders were, right? So if he's going to sort of create these grain silos, he needed to know who was going to be engaged in that and where he might see backlash. He also needed to know things like how much food would need to be stored to survive, what geopolitical systems are going to be impacted, right? So when you think about the biblical story, this really starts with people coming into Egypt. So the Israelites moving into Egypt because of that famine. And then what are the tangible impacts of people's lives in Egypt? So as we see a famine, what do we need to do to mitigate these things? And that's really where you end up with this. So what you can do to mitigate? So Joseph provided structures to help stabilize the Egyptian society so that they could manage those food shortages and not have social unrest. And so that is sort of a great model to think about climate resilience from our biblical perspective. So this is ministry and climate change from my perspective. It's where are we? How has the world shifted because of climate change? What's the current state of our infrastructure and risk? Where are we going? So how is climate change going to impact our communities? And then what can a local church do to mitigate these impacts for climate change so that we can minimize the suffering and the harm in the future? So let's start with where we are. And this isn't going to be so much of a science talk because you've already had that, but there's a little bit of science in here. So this is a graph that you've probably all seen. This is the global average temperature shift over the past 22,000 years. And what's important to me about this graph is right here, these 2 points. It's where we are and earliest human societies. So if you take away anything from this talk, It's all of our systems, our infrastructure systems, our educational systems, our theologies, our psychologies. Everything has evolved in a world. It's co-evolved with our environment that doesn't exist anymore. So all of the things that we have sort of built our expectations and understandings of are from a time period when life was extremely stable and predictable. And so we are exiting that, and we're continuing to exit that each year, further and further away from those baselines. And so we need to really be rethinking all of our systems. This is global CO2 production. What you will notice is that we keep, not only are we not actually decreasing the amount of CO2, we're actually we're producing record amounts of CO2 each year into the atmosphere. And so we are accelerating further and further away from that baseline. Despite all of the talk of technological advancements, we are continuing to move further and further away from where we were. And unfortunately, that is increasing at an exponential rate. So this past year, we exceeded 1.5 degrees Celsius as the global average temperature. You might realize or have heard about the Paris Agreement. So we sort of exceeded that. You might hear people give a lower number. That's because they're using averages. So if you do a 20-year average or something, then that number comes a little lower. But because we're on an exponential curve, the reality is that we've exceeded that and we're not going to go back. And so we're looking at really greatly exceeding our expectations for what we would consider to be a safe living environment for people. And that has big changes already, and we've seen those in our environment. So this is the USDA Plant Hardiness Zone map for Indiana. It's a nice long state, so you can see changes, but these are ecosystem migration, essentially, where these are the plant assemblages that are stable at different zones. And you can see this is about 10-year difference. And there's a large shift in how climate is affecting what plants are viable. Now, what is to note in this graph is plants don't migrate that fast, right? And so this is really problematic and challenging for our ecosystems because our plants can't move at a decadal scale of migration. And yet the climate is. And so we're really looking at big changes that we need to be thinking about. So just to give some headlines, in some big broad strokes, we're on course for more than 3-degree spike, even if our commitments are met. Lately, there have been reports coming out that we might see that really pretty quickly. Even I've seen one report where hit 3 degrees potentially by 2100. We know the driver of climate change, and it's not CO2 production, it's affluence. So our lifestyles are the things that are actually driving these problems. And so if we're not having conversations about how to change our lives, then we're not actually addressing the fundamental driving points for climate change and ecological destruction. We're looking at near-term impacts. Some people are warning about 2050 as a magic date. We're already seeing big impacts in our communities, though. If we didn't change anything, right? So if we basically allowed our infrastructure to go to its lifetime that we've built for, we would still exceed our targets. And so that means that if you installed a boiler system in your church and they said this boiler is going to be good for 30 years and you installed that 5 years ago, we would have to decommission all of that infrastructure, right? That is still considered good to meet climate targets. And so we're really stuck in a hard spot with our infrastructure because people don't want, obviously, to take things out of their lifespan before it's considered not good. And we're seeing things like crop shortages, large-scale inflation because of that, and then energy crises, flooding, electrical grids going down, also inflation and spikes in energy pricing for our communities, and potential massive disasters with tipping points. So there's some estimates that we might be able to break the ocean currents and the atmospheric currents, and that would basically throw us into climate chaos. In 2 degrees Celsius, again, sort of some people think that we might cross that threshold by 2050. So within the next, 10, 15 years, if we're already at 1.5, because we're on that exponential curve, we're looking at really short-term increases in temperature, which will have massive impacts on our world. So what does this mean for a local community, right? These are all big impacts. These are global things, but this is really what we're thinking about today is our local impacts. So we can think about climate change in three broad categories. We can think about baseline and chronic impacts, which are the slower changes that are happening because the general climate is changing. So these are things like agricultural declines, increased pricing with inflation, supply chain disruptions will go in there, migration and gentrification, increased medical demand, restriction of water, political destabilization and polarization, general temperature shifts, and then also there are psychological effects that come into. So we know that climate change affects people's psychology. They shift from being abundant and sharing to sort of this scarcity mindset where people hoard resources and go to in-group, out-group dynamics where they'll hoard together people like themselves. And we have these punctuating catastrophic impacts of climate change. This is what we see in the news. So these are things like our floods, our droughts, our famines, our hurricanes, our vortexes, our wildfires, heat waves, tornadoes, and then things like pandemics and political revolutions. And then we have our transitional impacts. So we're trying to shift from a fossil fuel-based economy to a what we would call maybe a green economy. I struggle with that term because there's a lot of mining impacts, but we'll say a non-fossil fuel-based economy. And so there are a lot of shifts that will happen for communities because of that. So there's mining, there's community economic job loss, increases in local disease and pollution. More and more, we're talking about geoengineering, which would be a transitional thing. So people are proposing things like putting sulfur into the atmosphere or potentially blocking out the sun or directing the sun's rays in different ways. There are also impacts for recycling and mitigation, then different impacts for different types of energy production. So for our ministries, if we're ministry leaders, what does this mean for us? When we think about our baseline impacts, things like increased demand on our food pantries. We have a higher need for utility assistance as utility inflation increases. We have need for housing. We have lower housing stock as people move. Increased insurance rates as insurance companies can't hold the burden of climate change, right? So they're increasing natural disasters. Our insurance rates are going up. We're seeing scapegoating of vulnerable individuals, and that goes to psychology. Increased rates of depression, increased rates of gun violence and domestic violence, and then also just general reduced income and ability to deal with these problems because of inflation. And then catastrophically, we're dealing with things like natural disaster recovery. So it seems like I'm in St. Louis. Every year, I'm dealing with some sort of natural disaster recovery situation. This year we had a massive tornado, but last year was flooding. And so every year I'm doing some sort of natural disaster recovery. We have increased need then for emergency shelters. We have increased need for cooling stations as our heat waves become more prominent. General needs for emergency electricity. So to run things like CPAP machines and dialysis machines. The first thing on my Facebook that popped up when our tornado came through is we need electricity because people basically need to run their dialysis machines. And who has electricity? So need for clean water. That's not just for drinking, but also infant formula, which is a much more timely thing. Also need for peacemakers and community support, large group facilitation in natural disasters. And then we started, some organizations have started talking about spiritual and emotional crisis first responders. And so the need for people to really be able to step in well in a crisis and to deal with that. And then again, with transitional things, we have utility bills, job losses, local pollution, colonial impacts. So a lot of the mining is sort of relying on colonialism and sort of existing colonial structures. So we've outsourced in the United States and in Europe a lot of those mining impacts to nations that can't sort of work against us. And so in South America and Africa, and then in Southeast Asia, is where a lot of the mining is done. And so our sort of green transition is built on those impacts to those communities. So what is our current risk? If we're thinking about our current infrastructural risk for our communities, so how do we begin to think about that? If we're in a faith community and we can see all these problems that we're going to have, how do we begin to understand what are our problems and where can we go? So I'm going to give you a couple examples of ways to begin to think about this. You're also going to get a handout with access to these links and ways that you could actually go and investigate data yourself or find someone to help you. Um, so we can think about the general community resilience. FEMA does an evaluation of this. It's the Resilience Challenge Index, and it looks at the physical and social properties of your community to tell you how resilient you are to natural disasters. And so this is for Elkhart County, which I just did worked with them. And so you can see their resilience. And then we can also look at things like social vulnerability. And so the Social Center for Disease Control does social vulnerability. And there are a suite of characteristics that you can look into to say what is making your community vulnerable to natural disasters. And that could be things like poverty, but it also can be things like education, ability to speak English, access to vehicles, things like that. And again, so for Elkhart County where I was, that was relatively high. And you can even begin to see, this is on a census track, you can see where within your community people are vulnerable and they're not vulnerable. So if we're thinking about ministry work, we can then begin to start to target our areas, to think about who we need to build bridges with to help them in climate change. And then we can look at natural disaster risk. And so FEMA also does an evaluation of current natural disaster risk. And so it's a combination of resilience and vulnerability, and then coupled with what the risks are for your local community. And so you can look at things. So for Elkhart, their biggest risks are heat waves, cold waves, strong winds, and tornadoes. And that's northern Indiana. But that's going to be different per community. So again, we can begin to think about how to prepare our communities in different ways to meet different needs. And then we can go in and sort of look at very, very specific level things like our water infrastructure and flooding. So by law, each community is required to evaluate their water's infrastructure and their risk for contamination. So one of the big challenges that we see in natural disasters is the loss of access to drinking water. And so we can begin to see if that's a possibility, and then we can have strategies to mitigate that. And so for Elkhart, they have a lot of people on drinking water wells. And so even though they have a good municipal system and their municipal system is relatively resilient, if there's flooding, which they expect to see, then a lot of their people are going to lose access to their water because they're on private wells. And so again, as a church and a faith community, we can begin to think about that and how to actually meet people's needs in those situations. Another challenge that we're seeing across the country is our electricity and power outage data, our electricity and power outages. And so again, on your handout that you'll get, if you haven't already, there are places that we can actually see what that is. And so what is the risk of electrical outages based on historical data? To think about, do we need to start hardening our churches to provide electricity? And housing affordability. So again, this is going to change a lot of the social dynamics if people have houses, if they're house poor. There are calculations that can be done, like the Housing Affordability Index, that will tell you, can people afford to live in a house? So basically, if the median income of an individual, can they afford the median income house? And so this will tell you a lot about, can people actually afford to live in your area? And then that will have impacts. And so some churches are converting their buildings over to things like affordable housing. And food insecurity, again, for community baselines, Feeding America does a great job. You can get percentages on how many people are food insecure, and they also break that down by race. And so for Elkhart County, you can see something like 32% of individuals who identify as Black are food insecure, whereas only 14% of all individuals in Elkhart County. And so you can see sort of a racial disparity in food insecurity. And again, when we're thinking about ministry, these are opportunities then to really target and think about what we're doing to meet people's needs. We can look at things like segregation as well. This will tell us a lot about natural disaster recovery. We know that after a natural disaster, wealthier communities tend to get wealthier and poorer communities tend to get poorer. So wealthy communities are able to get more resources poured into them and actually historically have done better. So after a recovery, they're actually better off than they were before, whereas poorer communities end up doing a lot worse. And so there's sort of this imprint of racism onto our natural disaster recovery. And so again, as faith communities, we can start to think about our segregation And we can start to think about how to meet community needs and understand where needs are going to be, and think about how we can contribute to that recovery. And just generally, inflation is putting a lot of pressure on communities. And so in Indiana, from 2021 to 2024, inflation rose by about $12,000 a year, for people to keep their standard of living. You need to spend $12,000 more dollars a year, and salaries didn't generally raise by that much. And so those numbers are different state by state, but they're available and they're pretty consistent in that sort of ballpark. And so people don't have as much money now to actually put into things like recovery, but also just living. And we can also look at historical events, to think about where our community is and what our risks are. So the past is always a good way to think about the future. And so this is a great picture of Mobile, Alabama. That's their convention center. They're having challenges with seawater, ocean flooding, but also increased hurricane intensity. And so I worked with the community there, and we're thinking a lot about, yeah, how do you prepare for flooding? How do you deal with their shelters overflowing, which happened the last big hurricane, where basically people were running around Mobile looking for housing, and churches were then trying to figure out how to open their doors, instead of being prepared. And we can look, really specific level things, so trade organizations, NGO reports, and government reports to get an understanding of the current situation. I always like to highlight this for churches because I'm in the midst of it too, where insurance is becoming increasingly expensive, and difficult, and projections are, hard for the insurance market. We're going to be paying more. We're already paying more. Insurance companies are leaving certain areas because it's not profitable to provide insurance. So this past year, our insurance company told us in St. Louis they were doing us a favor by increasing our rates by something like 15%, by just keeping us on insurance. And so we can also look at things like models for flooding and things like that, that many communities have as well. And these NGO and governmental reports will be localized, and we can sort of highlight and target very specific needs then. So quick, question: what information, when you think about your own community, would you want to know about climate change and how that's affecting your community if you were going to change your ministry? And you can feel free to unmute too if you want to talk.
Yeah, Josh, this is Chris Wilson. I'm in Olathe, Kansas. Just all the statistics you've thrown out, in various categories, really interesting stuff. For churches to kind of do assessments of their local communities, is there like two or three key places to go to capture those statistics versus like going to 50 different places, in terms of statistics? Is there a few places that can help churches along navigate better assessing their local community or surrounding communities? Like Olathe is more of a well-to-do neighborhood
Mhm.
in the Kansas City area. So maybe some partnering or neighboring, but we could spend a lot of time doing data research and less time helping people. So
Yes. Um, so I think there are a couple places that I'll go, and you have a worksheet that if it didn't get sent, it will, which has links, that you can click on and go to. So there are two that, and I'll talk about one of them later when we talk about projections. But the FEMA Community Resilience Indicator Analysis is a really nice map. It's a web app where you can click in and it'll tell you this huge list of vulnerabilities, and what are the top vulnerabilities. And you can look at that on a county scale and on a census tract scale. So if you're in a wealthy place, you're going to see where you are, but then you could also click on the vulnerable community next to you and you'll be able to see really quickly what is the thing that's making them the most vulnerable. And so that's really helpful. Also, the National Resilience Indicator, which is National Risk Indicator, sorry, for natural disasters, is also really helpful, to think about what response you would actually need, right? I think part of the thinking is we need to be really focusing on the immediate risks, the biggest risks, right? We don't want to try to solve every problem. We need to solve the biggest problems first, and prepare for the biggest problem. So I would go there first. But also, yeah, I mean, it is a lot. Yeah, yeah. Okay, we will move on, and then if you have other questions that come up,
Could I add just one? I'm sorry to be late.
oh yeah,
Uh, Don Arney in Kansas City. Kansas City area has a very high ratio between population and infrastructure. Our sewers, storm sewers,
no,
roads, utilities are all really spread out.
hmm
And as we do climate disaster kinds of things and just normal climate changes, uh, taking care of that infrastructure seems that might become a major problem.
yes, yeah. I mean, and this is something that is unfortunately not unique to Kansas City. I wish it was, but across the country, we're seeing situations where the infrastructure doesn't match the community in a lot of ways. Either it's old and it's decaying, or it was built with expectations. Either the community was going to be bigger, so people they thought the community was going to be bigger than it was, right? And so there aren't enough people, or it's spread out, or the communities are there are more people than the infrastructure was built for. And there are ways, and we'll get into it, to think about how you can change your own infrastructure to try to mitigate some of those challenges. But also, I think this is where advocacy on the local level becomes really, really helpful, right? So there's more potential to convince a municipality or a city to change their infrastructure than maybe do some of the national level organizing and advocacy. So if you're really aware of the local problems, you can then really push for really common sense things to be done to help. Yeah, because yeah, sewer overflow, or if it's a combined sewer system, is really challenging. And so making sure that yeah, that we're up to date with, wastewater mitigation and treatment, stuff like that's really important. Yeah.
Megan also says people's access to healthy, fresh food is one.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's, some of that is going to go into your food insecurity data. But also that doesn't capture how healthy the food is. And there is other information out there on food deserts and things like that, as well, that if you want, I could send you ways to find, are you in a food desert? The US government holds a lot of great data. They just don't make it that easy for people to find. So, all right, we will. So where are we going with climate change? Is the big question, right? So now we can create a baseline, and so then the question becomes, if we have a baseline and we have a future projection, what does that mean to our baseline? And so this is where I tend to think about sending people. So First Street Foundation provides community scale and parcel scale data for climate projections. And so you can go to their website, which is Risk Factor. You can type in Kansas City and it will give you multiple different risks. So it has, risks from heat waves, risks from flooding, risks to air pollution, risks for wind damage as well. And so they actually have done parcel scale models of climate change. And so that's a really good way to sort of start to think about these are how climate change could affect things. And so, yeah, I mean, when we think about Elkhart, which I just worked with, they're estimating that by 2050, 28% of all the properties will have an elevated flood risk, right? So then if I know a third of the properties have a flood risk and I'm a church, I can start to think about, well, what do I need, right? If we can create a group of churches that can provide beds for people, right? So that we have beds when there's a big flood, or can we have some extra food, or can we think about water purification? Because often flooding takes out our ability to purify water. And so can we think about our own buildings and things like that? Also, with heat waves, thinking about, okay, Again, in northern Indiana, they're looking at, 37 days a year, over 90 degrees, and 17 days a year over 100 by 2050. And so, again, we can think of our buildings as a potential to meet those needs. And those are big challenges, both for utility bills and the grid's ability to produce that electricity, but also just health and safety for people. And also we can look at like general climate shifts. And again, in the handout that you will get, there's a great website by the University of Maryland's Environmental Science Center, what'll sort of give you an analogous climate for your own city. So you can look at things. And so northern Indiana, we're expecting in 60 years is going to look like eastern Oklahoma. And so, yeah, big changes. It's a good way to think about how much these things are going to change. And if you're doing your own communication with your community, sometimes the numbers and the data are really hard to get through what these things mean, but they can understand one climate to another, right? So they go, oh, if we look like northern or eastern Oklahoma and I'm from, northern Indiana, they can start to see how much this is going to change and how much we really need to be thinking about. I mean, because 60 years is, the age of, many of our churches that's less than the lifespan of our church has existed. And so we're looking at a really short period of time when we're thinking about these things. And then there are global challenges that will affect us on a local level, so projections. We're expecting massive migration or displacement. Those estimates change and they range, but we're already seeing that. So when I was in Nashville for a while, we saw a huge influx of folks from California leaving wildfires. And the thing to think about within your own communities is it's usually the people with the most money and the most access to resources that leave first. And so in a climate situation, so when we think about gentrification, Nashville's a great example of that, where the Californians came in, they bought up all the really expensive properties, it sort of moved down the chain, and then all of the poor people basically didn't have places to live and rent became astronomical. And that's a direct effect of the wildfires and climate change. Again, building insurance rates are projected to continue to rise about 5% per year because of climate change for a lot of us. That's really, really expensive for our church buildings. Electrical demand is projected to increase, stressing grid capacities depending on where you're living. That's going to become more or less problematic. There have been some studies done on the Southeast where they don't think that we'll be able to actually produce enough electricity to keep the grid going in the summer because of climate change. And so we need to be investing heavily in ways to sort of stabilize that. And then we have other challenges like data centers are also now pulling a lot of energy, which exacerbate that problem. And then agricultural productivity, despite our estimates for technological advancement, we're expecting agricultural productivity to decline. And the reason for that is because temperatures are shifting outside of plant germination zones. So essentially, for the crops that we're growing, they won't be able to reproduce in the areas that we're currently growing them. So there will probably be some level of adaptation, right? So, instead of growing one crop, we'll probably shift to another, provide food for people, but we are expecting to see agricultural declines. And there will be a lot of probably challenges around that shift for agricultural communities. And then also you'll see that in the grocery stores. And just generally, we're already seeing these things, but more severe storms, things are becoming more expensive, increased rates of food insecurity, increased number of power outages, more pressure on housing, access to clean water, and other economic systems. And then, and we're already seeing this, we're expecting scapegoating. And so the targeting of marginalized communities, this typically happens, one of the first things that happens when people's mindsets shift to a scarcity mindset where they're afraid of not having enough resources. They start blaming people, and often that's immigrants and marginalized communities. Okay, so that was a lot. That was a whole lot of information in a very short period of time. So are there any questions or comments or things you need to get out?
I think that comparing cities is a helpful thing. I've heard presentations, I haven't looked at your resource, but I've heard presentations. A number of us are from the Kansas City area here. And I think, I can't remember what city it exactly was, but it was some city in Texas that the Kansas City will be similar to, after a number of decades, which think of kind of the hot weather of Texas. And then I'm also went to college and stuff in Minneapolis, and Minneapolis will be more like Kansas City. So that kind of shifting, when you start to think about climate change, I think that's a helpful kind of tool to help all of us kind of imagine what that could be like. I did have a question, Josh. Some of your resources are from like FEMA and those kinds of groups. We're probably aware that the government currently is either like firing people, or it's actually starting to, just delete information, or kind of I'm wondering if if there's any group that's kind of taking over the government resourcing space, or trying to maintain some of those things so that there's accurate information still available, because it feels increasingly, you know, suspect.
Yes. So, I mean, there are two challenges. Yeah, one, which you've highlighted, is just data availability. Another is FEMA has basically stopped really doing what they used to do. And so we're not getting the sort of disaster recovery money that we used to get, where a lot of communities' expectations for disaster recovery was just to rely on the federal government to come in and provide resources. So shockingly, that was actually a lot of their natural disaster response plans were just to wait for the National Guard. So that's becoming a less good estimation. But there are libraries and other organizations that are storing a lot of the federal data, and that's a really loose, sort of disparate community of places, but it is being stored, especially, and all the resources that are on your sheet I went to this morning, and they are good right now. So they're still running, but yeah, I mean, things like the National Climate Assessments. One of the things that the current administration did is they said they're not going to do any more climate assessments. And so by law, they were required to sort of basically give updates on how climate change was impacting communities, and how it's projected to impact regions. And they basically said they're just not going to do those sort of things. And so I do think we are heading into a time when, unfortunately, there's a tension. As far as I know, the people who are still working at the agencies are still doing great things, right? So the people who are working at NOAA, who are working at FEMA, but there is, I think, political pressure for them not to provide as specific climate level data. I mean, I know for sure as far as funding goes, climate change was eliminated as a phrase that people could even use for grants in the scientific community. And so a lot of folks had to rework their language and things like that. But that's also agency dependent, right? And so like the National Science Foundation said, okay, climate change language is fine. But I think NIH had some different changes, so.
Thanks.
Yep.
This is Chris again. One of the things our church has tried to do the last several years around issues of justice and ecology and care for the earth is one of those. It's kind of a blend of what we call mercy versus justice. And I'll define those. Mercy is like the immediate need you see right in the moment. And the justice piece is trying to address as best you can the systemic issues that create the need in the first place. And so we try to have conversations in our different ministry groups around that balance of not ignoring the immediate need, or not ignoring the system that created the need, but how do you spend time in both arenas?
Yep.
And so that's some of the things, kind of the challenges and opportunities that our church tries to navigate with some of these kind of things, especially around climate change and ecology stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm right there with you. I mean, I think it's, and my sense is the best strategies, and we'll get into strategies momentarily, is just how do we build the systems that meet the immediate needs, right? So we're working on that sort of systemic level of building the thing. So we're not participating. So we're actually building new infrastructure or new systems, right? And so it's not relying on the old things to meet people's needs, but to actually increase the capacity is sort of how I think about that. So it's a good segue. So what can we do as a local church to mitigate some of these impacts and to really change our ministries? So I really love this quote. I think it's a really smart quote. This is by Bill Mollison, who's the one of the sort of originators of permaculture thinking. It's the problem is the solution. So for a lot of us, we're in a moment where our churches are struggling, finances are hard, and we have a lot of challenges, but it also means that we have buildings that are really, really valuable and that we can use, and we do a lot of creative things. So this is the sometimes called the resilience cycle or the adaptive cycle. And this is a life cycle of ecosystems, but it also works within organizations. And I'm going to walk through this because it helps us think about how to address our ministries. So we can start with an organization. We can say that they're going to grow, and that organization will start and they will grow, and along this line, and then they become set in their ways. So they build systems, and then those systems become entrenched. So what I like to think about as a good example is, I don't know if any of you have had to have an argument or a conversation about switching from pews in a church to chairs in a church. But once something is in place, so if pews are in place, switching to chairs will become a big problem. That system is entrenched, and you might have your entire life being taken over by a conversation about pews and chairs. Right. So once it's entrenched, things become stuck and they eventually become brittle. And then they'll go through a collapse phase where eventually something will happen to that system when it becomes too brittle and everything will break. And so this is sort of where I see the church at the moment, is we're right on that edge of being too brittle and starting to break. Where the systems and structures that we've built for our faith communities aren't really quite working right now. And we're starting to see those first signs of breaking in the United States. And then it goes through a complete breakdown where everything breaks. And then there's a period, which is really interesting, where you can do really creative things, right? So within an organization, everything is broken. And so you can reorganize and you can reshape things. And so again, back to our pews and our chair structure. So imagine we had a natural disaster and it broke our sanctuary. You know, the conversation about pews and chairs becomes a lot easier, right? We can do really creative things, or we could say, oh, we're going to put in a handicap thing here. We're going to, I don't know, maybe bean bags, right? You could do all kinds of creative things. And there are all these opportunities to really think differently in that collapse and release phase. And then basically the system reorganizes itself. So everything starts to become entrenched again. And then it becomes entrenched, it grows, it becomes brittle, and it falls. And that is a system that happens within ecosystems, but also continually patterns within organizations. And so when we're thinking about changing our ministries, we really need to think about where they are and where the opportunities are to actually make those changes. Because we'll spend a lot of time trying to change something that is really entrenched, and we're not going to get very far, and we're going to get really frustrated. And so it's really looking for those areas in our churches and our ministries where growth and change is going to be easy, and then maximizing that opportunity. And so we can really be strategic here about how we approach our challenges and where we can see movement. So let's talk a bit about climate resiliency as ministry. And so what does it look like then to build a resilient ministry? So this is my model for my organization, how I think about things and how I think about faith communities. You are, as a faith community, one member of community support within a larger society. You know, there's the government, there are hospitals, there's police and firefighters, there are farms, there are nonprofits. You're all working together to provide people support in your community. Climate change is decreasing the ability of other organizations to provide support. It's decreasing the amount of support coming into your community, and it's decreasing what you can send out of your community, and it's increasing your needs in your community. This is sort of with all of those impacts we've talked about, this is what it is doing. And so what we can think about doing then is increasing our capacity physically to help offset those other losses. And that's really my sort of goal then, to build a resilient ministry, is really to increase the overall capacity of the community by strengthening the faith community's capacity to meet these needs. Because we know the other organizations aren't doing the things to help them build them up, or what they're doing isn't going to meet all of these needs. So basically what we want to look at for ministries then is we want to look at our climate impacts and our existing vulnerabilities to find that sweet spot of what is the impact going to be and where's my vulnerability, so I can maximize the amount of good that I can do with the space that I have. And so when we think about this, we've talked about all these impacts, we've talked about vulnerabilities, talked about what the potential future is. So let's think about our ministry in that sort of space. Right now, there are generally two models that we can think about for church ministry. I sort of fit this. There are resilience hubs, which you might have heard about. I like to think of those as like Noah's Ark approach, where we're going to just basically take our church, we're going to put all these, things on the church, we're going to harden the infrastructure. And this is like for a natural disaster, when everything is falling apart, that church is going to have a lot of resources. And then there are also community-based climate resilience, which is sort of, I think about that as the Garden of Eden. This is like changing your infrastructure to meet community needs on a day-to-day level, right? So it's not going to really help with the natural disaster, but it's going to change things with day-to-day hunger, stuff like that. And we need both of these, is the reality, right? So it's not a matter of one is better than the other. We need both, but also each community is going to be differently set up to either do one or the other. And so it's okay if you can't become a resilience hub. There are other ways to be helpful, and that's needed. And so generally when we think about our issues, we can say we have our baseline chronic issues, or sort of our Garden of Eden issues. These are the things where we need to change our ministries to change the baseline conditions. Whereas for the punctuating catastrophic things, we need those resilience hubs. So we need the emergency responses, we need the lots of resources that are available. So let's talk about what does it look like to build an ark, right? To build a resilience hub. Again, this is being an emergency community resource during a natural disaster. And so we need to be able to provide electricity. We need clean water, we need shelter, blankets and clothing, and then non-perishable food. All right, and communities are already doing this across the country. Often it's with private-public partnerships to do that. And so when we think about electrical production and storage, so putting in solar panels and battery backups, or using hybrid inverters on solar panels to have some battery system, things like conventional generators and then solar generators as well. So we're able to provide that electricity in an emergency, and then we're prepared to do that. If we're worried about water purification, we can think about reverse osmosis purification systems. So Grace Lutheran, I believe in Colorado, put in an RO system. And so they're going to be able to provide clean water for people, even if their municipal system goes down, right out of their church. And then depending on your geography and geology, places are putting in cisterns. So it's just large storage tanks of water, or even having adequate bottled water as well on hand for distribution. And then sheltering. So again, if we're building an ark, people are going to lose their housing in a flood or something like that. We need cots, sheets, pillows, blankets, first aid. Television is really important, especially for some folks with PTSD or with certain mental health issues. And then having those plans in place, right? So instead of being caught behind where something happens and you're running around trying to see, well, we can open our sanctuary, having that plan in place really becomes key there. And there are organizations that can help with this. The Red Cross is one. There are good reasons to be a Red Cross shelter. There are also good reasons that faith communities choose not to do that. I'm not endorsing either. I'm just saying they are an organization that does help with that. So what does it mean to have a successful resilience hub? You really need to coordinate with your local government and other NGOs when you're going to do this, because you want to be in a situation where they know where to send people. And so working with them, with local government, other organizations, allows you to coordinate those resources. It also helps pool resources. So if we're thinking about community-based resilience, then these are things that are going to help our baselines, but aren't necessarily going to meet those emergency needs. So we can think about increasing, localizing, and diversifying our food production, right, to help people with food insecurity. We can shift our land use for general hazard mitigation. We can develop networks of mutual aid and outreach to decrease the burdens on low-income individuals. So basically, how do we share resources across a community in advance to help people who are needing them? We have increased needs for low-income housing. We can work on that, and refugee services. And then just increasing our accessibility to HVAC and to cooling and to warming places. And so we think about how do we open our building during the day in ways that are humane. So can we run a movie series in the summer during the day so that families can leave and watch a movie and not have to run their own AC, right? So they can save some money on their utility bills. And that's something that many of us have space that's available to do that. And that's a really easy way to lower grid load, to lower people's pain, and doesn't really cost us a lot. And so, yeah, cooling stations. So if we're thinking about flood mitigation, we can change our grounds, native plants. We can put in retention ponds, rain gardens, general emergency sheltering too. So not the big natural disaster stuff, but just the cold nights. And then having supplies on hand, and then we can coordinate with other faith communities. So what does it look like to do food production? If we're worried about something like that, the City of Agriculture has put in permaculture food forests, and this is a strategy to build perennial food that just provides food throughout the year. And we don't have to replant every year. We can just sort of upkeep that. And so some faith communities are doing that. We also can think about community gardens, indoor hydroponics and aquaponics. So as outdoor yields becomes harder to get outdoor yields, we can think about indoor gardening and using our faith communities for that. Living walls, and then rooftop gardens. So when we look at, this is a aerial photograph of 8th Street Mennonite in Goshen, every single bit of green space can be used for food production outside, right? So we can really think about all of our space can be maximized to meet people's food needs, and then we can do things inside as well. So there's a picture of a living wall. There's also a picture of a hydroponic garden was inside Zion United Methodist Church in Las Vegas. And so churches are doing this. There's also a really cool project, a Presbyterian church in Texas, where they have a giant hydroponic garden doing tomatoes, and then they also are a resource distribution. So people are coming in from throughout the community and dropping off food, and then they are providing massive amounts of food as sort of this center of distribution. So they're providing and then producing and then collecting as well. If we're worried about flooding, we can think about native plants, rain gardens, stormwater catchment systems, but also permeable pavement, right? And so we can change our infrastructure itself to allow water to go back into the ground. Again, these are baseline things that we can do to reduce our overall risks. And then low-income housing. So churches are increasingly changing their buildings to be housing. This is an architecture sketch by one church that is working on basically converting their building, their multiple buildings, into a large low-income housing facility. And so we can do these things as ways to reuse our buildings or to rethink them as we can't maximize their use to meet other community needs. And then things like community safety. And so neighborhood check-ins and phone trees. In Philadelphia, they have one in place for heat waves, where they're calling people who are shut-ins or otherwise don't get out to make sure everyone's safe in a heat wave. Having transportation plans in place, both for your community, your faith community, and other communities. So if you have flooding, do you know who needs to get out? How do you check on people, and how do you get people out? And those are things that, again, they don't cost money, they're just time. That's really going to help. Knowing potential community medical needs, knowing what resources your community and your faith community is prepared and can provide in advance, so that when eventually you get a phone call saying we're trying to gather resources, you say, okay, we have these things on hand and we can help. And then also just being connected to your local community to know who else is providing what resources. And then advocacy and organizing is really helpful in making some of these bigger changes. So, does your community have a climate change response plan? So, many municipalities have those, and many municipalities don't. And so, knowing, what is the government trying to do? What are they thinking about? And what does that look like? And if they're not thinking about it, can we advocate for them to start thinking about it, right? So, can we develop a sustainability commission or something like that? Um, Also, groundwater protection laws or drinking water protection laws are often implemented at a local level. And so there are ways that we can protect our water sources at a local level, and we don't need to even move to the state or to the federal level, and where we can have a lot more. So that will go back into your source water assessment reports and understanding what your water risks are. But there are ways then to change regulation on a local level to help protect water resources. Some states have laws requiring backup emergency water systems, some don't. And so that's good to look into. Again, if we're advocating for things, this is a great way to provide a great amount of resilience through advocacy. And then looking into your county's emergency or city's emergency response plan. What is shocking for a lot of people is the response plans are inadequate if they exist. And a lot of them really are just asking the federal government to help them. And so then we can advocate for maybe a more holistic understanding of natural disaster emergency response that meets communities' needs. So those are a few examples. There are a myriad of ways that we can actually increase these things. But now I think I'm going to open up our time for questions.
All right, that's a lot of information, a lot of suggestions, and probably one focuses one or a few at a time. But I'm curious what questions or thoughts people have, or what are you already doing? What came to mind for myself is we have an organization here in the Kansas City area, and Noni and I actually just met with the managing director of it called Climate Action KC. And they do they especially are trying to bring down greenhouse gas emissions and have a big regional plan and are working on it. And so we're meeting to see how can faith communities kind of connect with them and work with them. What you're talking about is broader than that in terms of, adaptation and response to emergencies. But they do a lot of, at the climate conference we had a workshop by that Emily, and she told us about how to do local advocacy, attending our city council meetings and things like that. So it's something that maybe many of us are not doing, but I think that's what the level that you're talking about, Josh, right, is getting really involved at that local city level to figure out what's going on and start to make ourselves heard. And actually, because not many people do, she says it has a pretty big impact, each person who does it.
Yeah, and I think to piggyback on that, a lot of environmental regulation is local and can be done at a local level. And so this is really a great opportunity where working to try to get national or even state level politicians is much harder. And it's not just environmental regulation. A lot of the conversations that I'm a part of around immigration reform are laws and things that we can pass on a local level that would require federal agents to identify themselves and things like that. So there's a lot that can be done on sort of this level that a city or a municipality has autonomy on, that can be really, really beneficial. And honestly, if you're involved in faith communities or your pastors, you're probably really only, if you're not already connected, you're one or two steps away from people that can make these changes. And so there really is a great potential there. I think often we miss in climate spaces because we're thinking on this global, big scale, whereas really we can do a lot on a local level. Yeah, Sue?
Just a couple of things. First, responding to the question that came earlier about where do we go to get information locally. I know that there are people visiting local churches here in Overland Park. I'm not sure if Olathe, but there is FEMA coordinators locally and connected with the county that are evaluating buildings and coming to churches to see what type of support we would be able to provide in a disaster. They'll come and look at the building. And then, and in our instance, this happened a couple of months ago. I think there's still some follow-up work being done because we were working on our roof at the time. But they'll even take the drone and look down on top of the building for the space. They'll look at access points, points of, central so for our particular building, it's we would be a great donation drop-off site, so to speak. And so I got connected through our local police department who was connected. So I would just start calling around at the county and seeing if you can get a visit if you haven't already, because they're being proactive around here on those things. And I, after going through all this training, I'm keen on just looking at all that we do and helping the congregation understand how important it is what we've done. I think in many cases we've done things because, we're good Christians and we want to do this or that, but it hasn't necessarily been tied into how we are creating resilience because of climate change. It's all, because we have a community garden and we have a mini food pantry. And so we are supporting the community in ways that are targeted. But we haven't developed the language and the narrative around this is important, it's missional, because we know the world around us is changing. I think there's still a little level of potential denial, or we don't want to have to deal with something this big. So that's kind of the tension and the challenge point that I see, especially in a small congregation. So whatever thoughts you have around that, I would love to hear.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of good reasons that I work. One of the main reasons I work with faith communities, though, is because I think there's a huge potential, and we already do a lot. I think one of the unique things about a faith community, right, where we become particularly helpful in climate change is we're not driven by market forces. So our ability to act and to help our community doesn't need to meet a particular bottom line. It doesn't have to make economic sense. We really have the flexibility a lot of the time in our missional work to really think smartly and strategically on how to help people in ways that don't have to meet sort of the logics and understandings of the rest of the world. And so I think helping our faith community see that, right, to say that we don't need a return on investment, right? Feeding someone doesn't have a monetary return on investment, but it really helps all of us. And so I think this is one of the great things about doing this work in climate change work in a faith community is we really have an opportunity to do something really extraordinary in ways that other organizations are really bound and they can't do that.
That's our theology, isn't it? Jesus keeps telling us to do stuff without expecting anything in return.
Other comments or questions? When I would want to highlight the possibility, if possible, of putting on solar panels on churches or homes as well. But as you're probably aware, churches and nonprofits have the potential still for a 30% direct pay back of their price if they get started very soon. I think they have to start those solar panels by July, and then they'd have a couple of years to get it done. But I have heard of churches, I think this was out in California, that, well, first of all, right now they had solar energy production from solar panels that was more than their church actually needed. So they were able to share that some with their lower income community. I'm not quite sure how, they actually did that, but they were able to kind of do that. But then they may be at batteries too. They did become that center where people could come when the grid went out. And because they had solar, they still were able to get electricity for even charging phones or often the grid goes out at the worst weather, whether it's hot or hot weather too, is very life-threatening. And so a little bit of cooling or in cold weather too, or as you mentioned, other kinds of life-saving machinery. So that is something that could be done. And what it does for the church is it pays back about 7 years, and so then the next 25, 30 years is a huge amount of money saved that then can be used for ministry. Because I think churches, one thing we kind of struggle with is just the financial piece of some of those changes that need to happen. But solar is one where you can actually be saving money in about 5 or 7 years, and then that can go into continuing to upgrade. And the other thing I'm really encouraging is kind of electrifying, switching over to high efficiency heat pump kind of systems. And again, they'll save money. And if we don't think we can do it, then kind of that making a plan feels really important for emergencies, but also making a plan so when the heat system goes out in our church, we just don't put in another gas water boiler, but switch it over at that point to an electric one. And if we ideally have, solar, then we've really got a system that is both low emission, efficient, and can be used to serve communities. And homes can be little hubs like that too, with the same kind of planning. And then they can, there could be a sense in the congregation of thinking about our neighbors, and maybe our homes also become those miniature resiliency centers.
Yeah, and I would add the way that I talk to congregations about solar is twofold. One, what you're essentially doing when you're buying solar is you're locking in a price point, right? So you're paying for your energy up front with that infrastructure. And so really with the projections for utility increases, this makes a lot of sense to do that, right? So if you have the capital to put in now, you're basically going to, in the long run, it's going to be a lot cheaper. Also, with battery systems, and there are ways that you can actually convert, you can use convert off of, so if you have existing solar, you can actually put in batteries and you can think about how to get off the grid. Because when the grid goes down, even if you have solar, if you don't have some sort of way to create a microgrid or get off the grid, then you basically lose your electricity. For the battery systems, though, depending on your utility's rate structure, you can set this up so basically you'll collect energy and your batteries will kick in during high rate times, right? And so basically you won't be paying then into your high rate times. And so you could essentially get to a place, and you don't even need solar to do that. With battery systems, you can just generally do that. And so you can drastically reduce your overall utility bill depending on rate structures of where you are. And so there are a lot of really smart things that you can do around electricity production that create resilience while also saving you a bunch of money. Yeah, I think it's for a faith community, if you have the capital to do it, it makes a lot of sense. Yeah. Megan?
Yeah, thank you. This has been so helpful. And I'm also in Kansas City, and how, as other people have pointed out, really depending on where you're located in the city, the issues are really different. And I guess where I'm going with this is where our church is located and just the current moment of our church. I feel like we're really restricted in both manpower and financial capital, because the immediate needs, those mercy needs, are really high. And we're definitely seeing it right now that like every week somebody's coming with like maybe needing rent assistance or food or, which, so kind of, but we are a small and large, like stretched, I guess, congregation, which maybe that will change in the future, but we do have space. We have a lot of space, and that is one asset that we have. So I guess it's kind of exciting to think about how even that can be something without needing a lot of resources at the moment that we could maybe use. Like you said, in the summer, we're running the AC anyways. We have a childcare facility, so maybe like opening it up for people to just use as a cool public space or something. And so I guess I just wanted to say thanks for those ideas, or ask if you have any other kind of specific recommendations if we have space, but we don't have that much that we can like invest into it at the moment financially. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a couple things. I think one of the realities, which is a great opportunity. So there are a lot of churches with a lot of money and a lot of resources that are looking for opportunities to help, right? But they're not in a position to do that because they don't have those connections.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think creatively a lot about how do I build programs, right, to get resources so where churches that want to be helpful, and they can really feel good about that. So one of the things I'm doing in St. Louis with my own congregation is we've decided we're doing a youth program where we're taking youth in and they're going to come help work on our building, and we're working on building resilience. And so they're coming in on youth trips, and I'm teaching them about racism in St. Louis. And so that's a way for us to get bodies in and work in and build those connections with a community that has more resources, right? And also helps build resilience. And they feel really good about it because they're going to do something awesome with their youth. We feel really good about it. And so there are these creative things that we just generally do in ministry that we can sort of build those things and connections that really become helpful. And I really would, I think often when we think that we're always in deficit, right? We look at our problems and we say, this is a deficit. I have so many people asking for help, right? And we say, we would say that's a problem, right? Is that I'm overwhelmed with utility bill requests, or I'm overwhelmed with food requests. But to think of it as you're actually a center where people are coming in, you can meet those needs, and then you can just think creatively about how do you maximize that centeredness, will open up different possibilities.
That's really good. Thank you. Yeah.
I just also wanted to reemphasize that piece that you just mentioned again, because this can be, I'm not a pastor, but just trying to find ways to teach about this can be really daunting because the topic is so large and the needs so great all over the place. Um, but you mentioned continually the importance of connecting with others, the networking, the reaching across denominational lines, which is often so difficult for us, but so needed. And it just brings back the importance of remembering that we are one body in Christ, and maybe this is an opportunity to, exercise that. How can we make that real for each other? So I'm thankful for that reminder of the fact that we do need to connect, we do need to network, and what you mentioned about um, the times that we focus on our limits, how stretched we are, which is a real thing. But how do we go from that to a theology of abundance? And then just grab onto that and pray, but also work on it as well. So I just wanted to thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Sue.
Josh, how would we engage you to have a conversation with a congregation or a council to kind of set forth some of these ideas and help influence
Yeah.
some strategic planning? What how do you consult? When do you consult? What's your MO?
Yeah, so you can email me through my organization. You know, I so my general theory of social change is that the community and the culture should drive the activity and how it operates, right? Because ultimately, trying to impose a culture or a structure is hard. Um, but what I generally try to do is a workshop. So either preaching, so do some theological work, and then a workshop which includes um, visioning. So looking, and I generally sit down. So I give a presentation about, so I'll do it like an evaluation, like you just received, which is a site-specific community evaluation of challenges. And you'll actually get a handout of one that I did for Goshen and Elkhart to sort of see that. And then we sit down with maps of the church building. And so we look at the maps and we do drawings and we say, okay, this is, and then everyone dreams about what they can do. And that's a really good kickoff. And then depending on what the community wants, I do follow-up coaching as well. So just to keep projects on task, but sometimes it's just the need for the workshop too. Just for the leaders there to have, because sometimes it's, even though there are people within a community that are really good, having someone come from the outside is really what's needed to have a conversation.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
So we could just go to the website of your organization and connect with you.
Yep. And I'll
Okay.
put my email in the chat, and that'll be
Yo.
easier.
I want to go back to that question you said at the beginning. The challenge of doing climate work in this particular societal, cultural, national context. And I've kind of struggled with that too, because it seems like one of the major things we just really need to do is being kind of resisting the authoritarian direction that is basically undoing so much of the climate work that we've done in the past. But with your presentation, it really does, it strikes me again how much nonprofits, but churches are needed at this moment to be very attentive, because we are losing the national safety net, if you will, as you mentioned, with FEMA. It's being gutted, its way of responding. There's not as much caring in that whole situation. So communities are going to be left with much less resources when disaster strikes. And so it's more imperative now for us to really be thinking about these things and what climate change is doing, and the disasters that could be theirs, because we have less, because of the national situation, we have less resiliency overall. So it's a bigger calling to us.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, which I think is right. One of the things that sort of authoritarian regimes rely on is scarcity, right? They rely on people to have a fear, so they can actually convince them to do things that they wouldn't normally do, right? And so, I mean, a lot of the climate work and a lot of the environmental work is really trying to reduce people's fear, right? If people have enough, they don't feel the need to hoard resources, right? They don't feel the need to demonize someone else, right? There's not this sense of creating that other to blame when people feel like they're getting enough. And so I do think these things are all connected, and I do think it's really important to have that lens and to understand, putting in a community garden. Not only do we know, because there have been studies done, that it reduces gun violence, right? Because it changes the landscape of a community. But it's also sort of working on these like much deeper systemic issues of authoritarianism and scarcity and fear.
Any final questions or comments? Just have a couple minutes left. Megan.
Okay, so this might be a little bit out there, but I'm also thinking about this section of the population, young people, but all different ages, who are very concerned about climate change and about, yeah, the direction maybe that the government's going and stuff, but are not interested in church, and like, but what it would mean to kind of also be more, a third space in certain issues,
Mhm.
like seeing that as a ministry where youth, as you said, could get involved, even if they're not sure if they're on board with all the church aspect of it. And I just wonder if you put in any thought into that or seen, it's sort of a new question for me, but I'm just curious. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think about this a lot. I think about what does church actually look like, or what is church? So I'm coming from an Anabaptist perspective. And so our sort of missional work is very, very different. Our understanding of evangelism is different. We don't even, people get really uncomfortable with the word evangelism. So our understanding of evangelism is sort of, we try to do really good things in the world and hope that people join us if they see that it's really something they want to be a part of. And I think there's a lot for young people there, right? I think, from my perspective, our faith transforms us. It transforms how we interact with the world. Um, and being able to show how that faith is transformational instead of trying to convince someone of some belief system is really, really helpful. Because we have lost a sense of authenticity across a lot of sort of different Christianities in this country, right? Where people are asking this question of why does it say, make sure that, you feed the hungry and we have so many people who are starving. If 80% of the country says that they're Christian, and this is a foundational belief system within that doctrine, then why do we have hungry people, right? Why do we have people losing health care and the churches aren't yelling about this, right? So I think this is a real opportunity to show authenticity in ways that we already are. I mean, this is what is maddening to me is our churches, we do this, right? I think there's a disconnect between the ways that most faith communities get portrayed and the actual lived experiences of what they're doing. But I mean, I can tell you for my church, we put in a community garden, we garden, and now we have a bunch of Haitian refugees have shown up because they saw our garden, right? So now we're getting to like go through and be a community with them. And so yeah, I mean, there are ways that this public facing stuff really does show a lot of the internal work that we're doing. Um,
Well, thank you, Josh, so much. This has been very, very interesting and I think sparked a lot of thinking at our local level as well. So we're very grateful for what you've done, what you're doing in many places across the country, but then our time with you as well. Thank you. Um, for the rest of you, we will be meeting on Zoom in 2 weeks. Again, not next week, but 2 weeks on November 25th. Same time, same Zoom link. And this will be our last session for this series. And I will be leading a session with a focus on pastoral care in the context of climate change, caring for those experiencing anxiety, grief, guilt, and hopelessness related to climate change. I do hope you'll join us. I think one of the hesitations we have about even talking about climate change is we know there are some emotional responses to it when we do. And a lot of people are dealing with this alone. So it's an important area, and I do hope you'll join us. So thanks to all of you for participating today, and especially to you, Josh. And I hope that all of you have a wonderful day.
Thank you. Thank you all.